Maybe I needed that. Okay, let me try. Let's see now. Can you hear me now? Okay, very good. Okay, very good. Now we got that. And I cannot tell if Machado is here. Sorry?
We did this last week.
Yes, I'm just going to do a little review and then continue on to the unconscious state today. So, anyone else? Let's try this.
Yeah.
Let's try that. Can you live with that kind of light?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Better than the off and on. They came to fix the temperature, and I think in the meantime, because this is all computerized, they may have missed that other thing. Anyway, we'll try this. We have some natural light. Technology is great when it works. I always say technology is great when it works. Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Welcome back as we begin this course on the end-of-life bioethics. As always, we begin with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings, for the gift of life, for our family and friends, for having us here today once again, Lord, as we continue to delve deeply into these bioethical issues of human life, at the beginning of life, at the end of life. And particularly today, we ask your blessings upon the lecture, I ask your blessings upon all the students and all your people, especially during this Lenten season. We pray, Lord, for those who are in most need of your divine mercy. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. All right, I apologize for the recording last week. It was the old system of recording, and there was a lot of background noise, especially with questions and comments from students, so it was difficult to follow the whole argument. So I'm just going to review briefly the key points about the end of human life, that introduction of end of human life issues, all right? Before I do that, are there any questions or comments about anything? No? John?
You said we had a class last Saturday?
Well, it was a video that I sent, right? Yes, it was a video because we had the conference actually, and therefore there was no live lecture. All right, but we're beginning this end-of-life course. You've registered for it already since the beginning of the semester, so that's all taken care of. It's just that I split it half and half. And the end of human life, one basic thing to consider here is that in contrast with the beginning of life, with the beginning of any life, and particularly with human life, we're dealing with trillions of cells that are living at different stages, okay, different stages of development and different stages of specialization or specialization, differentiation. So at the beginning of life, we only deal with one cell, which is the zygote, and therefore, from that perspective, in my mind, it's much easier to determine is the zygote alive or dead, right? That will make a big difference bioethically. So what happens at the end of life is that we have these trillions of cells in our bodies, all constituting different organ systems, and the vital organs are within those systems, right? Of which we have about a dozen organs, depending on more or less how you classify them. But basically, these organs, they don't all die at the same time. In fact, they absolutely don't die at the same time, all right? These trillions of cells will die at different times. They could be days, weeks, or maybe several weeks between the first cell dying and the last cell dying in the body, the human body. So why do you do that? Well, the end result is that there's a dying process, right? There's a dying process. And the challenge, clinically, to begin with, is that at some point, a medical doctor has to declare this person dead, medically dead, and that becomes also the legal moment of death. So there can be a death certificate, all right, with a time and place, specific time and place. And also that will be our theological point of death, because we accept the clinical definition of death. In other words, we look at competency. Who is the person competent? Who is the professional in our society who is competent to declare someone dead, organically, biologically dead, is the medical doctor. All right, and so we abide by what the doctor says. We in the church, we theologians, bioethicists, go by what the doctor says. Okay, and so we dump it back on the doctor's lap. It is the doctor who has to determine whether this person is alive or dead. Okay, so they have to deal with their competency and the symptoms, the vital signs and so forth that they follow. And there's a protocol, obviously, that they follow to declare someone dead. And the law does the same thing that we do. The law follows whatever the doctor says. Okay. So it comes down to the vital organs. If you think about it, again, staying at least with the theory for now, all right? The theory, we are made up of many different organs integrated into systems, right? And different systems maintain us alive. But some of the organs of our body are not vital organs. They're important organs, but that doesn't make them vital, organically speaking. In other words, we can live without them. For example, the eyes. The eyes, you would think there would be vital in a figure of speech, figuratively speaking, but certainly blind people can be very much alive, right? And so the eyes, in fact, no one sense of the five senses, no one sense really is vital in the organic way, unless we take the skin as a whole, which would be tact. The sense of tact, the skin as a whole, for example, with burns that are very severe and the majority of the body is actually burned, the person really doesn't have a chance for survival, okay? So they go into palliative care, plus the intense pain that is involved typically in burns. But for the senses, we can do without any one particular sense and still keep on living. So as important as they are, the senses are, those organs are not vital organs. Also the reproductive organs, for example, as important as they are not vital for the individual. They're vital for the next generation for sure, but not for the individual. Excuse me, not for the individual, you see? But there are organs that are vital for sure. And so just beginning from the head down, of course, the brain as a whole, the whole brain, and also the brain stem, and then the heart, the lungs. For pair organs, we have to include both organs, okay? Because certainly people can live with one lung. Actually, there are 5 lobes in the lung, 3 on one side and 2 on the other. And people can live with down to 2 lobes of the lung. So both, when we talk about vital organs, both lungs, both kidneys, because people can certainly live with 1 kidney. Then the pancreas as a whole, the liver, again as a whole. The liver has, I believe, 3 lobes. And also the liver has a lot of regenerative power. So the liver can be sectioned, for example, with cancer or some kind of a disease or an injury, and typically it will recover. So the liver as a whole, and then the digestive tract, the stomach as a whole, the small intestine, and the large intestine, again, as a whole, all right? I don't know, did I forget anyone? Any other organ, vital organ? Okay, I've listed them here. Then, these would be, in general, in principle, theoretically, but then what happens today? Today, because of advanced surgery and also because of sophisticated dieting and a restrictive type of lifestyle, it turns out that one can actually live without a stomach, okay? And for that one, not much medication is needed other than a very strict diet, okay, of pureed material and so forth. Almost like a pre-digestion is done before ingestion, okay, but one can actually live without a stomach. The typical case here is, what do you think? Yeah, I have the cold like everybody else. It's going around. What would be a typical case for removing a stomach? The whole stomach. Cancer is a typical one, right? Okay. The pancreas also, but then what happens with the pancreas? With the pancreas, then the person needs some medication. Typically, it's going to be insulin, right? Insulin, because the pancreas produces insulin. And what does insulin do? It's an enzyme, John. Exactly, metabolizes sugar in the blood. So the sugar, there's a very important sugar balance of the blood, because sugar is essentially the gasoline of the cells for energy, right? The energy source to recharge those ATPs. And therefore, there has to be a critical amount of sugar in the blood. Too much or too little will damage the organs, including vital organs. And therefore, insulin is a vital enzyme, it's a vital substance, and it has to be supplied to the body, either naturally through the pancreas or artificially through an injection or through the little pump. Some diabetics have a little pump that they use, okay, and they turn on the pump when they're eating or just before or just after and so forth. So this one requires some more medication. And kidneys, a person can also live without both kidneys, right? But they definitely need to do what? They need to go on dialysis. Dialysis, right? And dialysis, what does dialysis do? It filters out the blood. Okay, so the patient is connected to a machine, both arms, one arm, the blood comes out into the machine, which looks like a huge refrigerator type. And there, for several hours, the blood is filtered of toxins and then pumped back through the other arm, back into the body of the patient. And so that machine is actually substituting the kidneys, because the patient either has no kidneys or the kidneys are atrophied, right? They're non-functional. The patient is on kidney failure, renal failure. And so that's an even more drastic intervention, if you will. But today, dialysis, in principle, is standard of care for renal failure, all right? So here's another discrepancy, and we'll talk more in detail about this, but sometimes what we call extraordinary means, bioethically or theologically, are actually standard means or standard medical practice. So from the clinical perspective, a procedure may be ordinary or standard, but bioethically, that same procedure on this particular patient may actually be extraordinary, and therefore it doesn't obligate morally, ethically. Okay, and this is a classical example, dialysis, where it is a standard care today for a person on renal failure. However, that machine, depending on subjectively on the patient evaluation, that could be considered extraordinary means of life support. Why? The key issue here is because it is not just assisting the kidneys, it is substituting the kidneys. That's a vital distinction. That's a vital bioethical distinction. Okay, that's going to be the key essentially for interpreting the end of life issues. And that's why I say the main aim or goal of this course is to distinguish between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support at the clinical level and at the bioethical level. All right, and what are the implications of that bioethically? So again, just like in the beginning of life issues, we need to be clear about the basic biology of what's going on with the body. All right, so you see that generally these are about a dozen vital organs, right? But with the clinical intervention today, these could be considered exceptions, but it's on a patient-by-patient basis. Okay, so any questions or comments there? We have to be clear on this basic biology to move forward with the analysis.
Not to be kidney dialysis or
yes.
whole is it become what is now?
Exactly. So that we know that the procedure itself is substituting the kidneys, right? We have established that. Okay. Then we have to look at the details. It's a little bit of anticipation, but I'm okay because today's lecture is not going to be that long. I don't think we're going to go for the whole 3 hours. So we can take some time to look at this since we're on it. All right. We have to look at the details of the technique itself. So kidneys actually have two functions in the body. One is to filter out the toxins, right? What we call metabolic waste. And what is that metabolic waste? What makes the urine yellow? Some kind of a nitrogen compound, right? It's ammonia, it's the breakdown of proteins mostly, but other ways from metabolism. So just like when we exhale, we get rid of also of a metabolic waste, but in this case, it's a gas. What do we get rid of when we exhale? Carbon dioxide, CO2, which is a metabolic waste of cellular respiration, all right? We saw, actually, it's anticipation of the next course when we look at respiration and photosynthesis. But basically, just like we get rid of CO2, which is a metabolic waste, it's a product of metabolism, of cellular metabolism, we also need to get rid of some substances, which is the breakdown of metabolism, the byproducts, which are toxic if they stay in the body. And that is done through the blood in the kidneys. These toxins are filtered out and they are soluble in water, okay? And so we excrete that water by way of urine, which means that the kidneys are also pulling out what from the blood? Toxins that are dissolved in water. So the kidneys are also sucking out water from the blood, meaning from the body, okay? So the kidneys also osmoregulate. The kidneys regulate the water level. Osmo is a reference to osmosis, to water or passive diffusion of water, all right? And so the kidneys have two functions. They have the function of filtering out toxins, but also osmoregulation. In other words, controlling the amount of water in the blood, just like the pancreas controls the amount of sugar in the blood, okay? Now, when we control the amount of water in the blood, more or less water, what kind of effect, what kind of physiological effect is that going to have? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's associated with the heart one way or another. Mechanically, organically, what is the heart? I'm not talking about Valentine's Day. I'm talking about the pump. It is a muscle. It is a cardiac muscle, right? It's a unique muscle that has a self-beating pulse, also connected to the brain stem for autonomic beating, but essentially a pump. And when a pump compresses and squeezes, what comes out through the arteries, right? Arteries go out of the heart, like the aorta, for example. Blood comes out under pressure, so blood pressure. Okay, so the kidneys osmoregulate the blood pressure of the body, all right? And so a kidney machine is really a sophisticated machine because it is essentially fooling around with the blood pressure of the patient during those 3 or 4 hours that the patient needs to be extended there on that lounge chair, right? So it's playing with the blood pressure, and that's why every time a patient goes on dialysis, the patient has to sign a consent form, and in case they go into cardiac arrest, there's got to be an intervention done, and therefore there has to be a nephrologist, there has to be a doctor on call in the dialysis centers, because any one of those patients could go on the cardiac arrest, and then a team has to come in and do CPR, or the patient can waive the CPR, all right, also. But anyway, that has to be signed before each time the patient goes on the machine, because that dialysis machine is going to do the osmoregulation instead of the kidneys. And there's nothing like the real thing, right? It's nothing like the kidneys because that's down to the molecular level, whereas the machine is going on some kind of computer algorithm and so forth. All right, so you see, that's why it requires technicians to run those centers and those machines, and it has to be regulated, and periodically they're monitoring. Each machine is being monitored on a screen to see that the blood level, the blood pressure is the proper one. Okay, and it's a dynamic thing also. Why? Well, why is it dynamic? It's not just maintaining a constant flow. For example, when you open the faucet, you get particular pressure, right? If you open more, you get more pressure, water pressure, less, you get less water pressure. It's a dynamic system. It is changing. Why? Because the heart is beating. And every time it beats, that heart is going to pump out 120 PSI, pound per square inch. All right? That's diastolic and systolic movement of the heart. And so, and that's going to happen on average to 60 to 80 times per minute. And so it's a very dynamic system, and that dialysis machine, that osmoregulator, has to adjust to the pumping of that particular patient at that particular time. And that's also why they want the patient as relaxed as possible. They're not on a treadmill or anything like that. See? Because they're trying to keep that heart as regular as possible. And the machine has to adjust dynamically at every heartbeat to maintain a constant blood pressure throughout the whole body. So all this to say, Luis, that for this particular patient at this particular time, I am already 85 years old. I've been on this machine for 20 years. I go Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 3 to 4 hours. And then I spend Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday and Sunday recovering from the drainage because it leaves me wiped out, and I don't want to do it anymore. It substituted my kidneys. My kidneys have failed. I'm a renal failure. 2 vital organs, the pair of vital organs has failed, which means that the death process has begun on me, okay? And I have arrested it because of the machine, but I don't want to do it anymore. I want the death process to continue and be the end of it. So we may allow that patient to die. We're not killing the patient, but we are allowing the patient to die. And then the whole thing changes to palliative care. There's no more cure because it's on chronic renal failure, and therefore there's no cure, but care always obligates, and we go into palliative care, which is going to involve, little by little, the larger doses, typically, larger doses of analgesics to deal with the pain and to deal with insufficient breathing and so forth. So the person is going to be sedated down. But then it comes down to the dosage. Sufficient doses to manage the pain and the anxiety and so forth, but not the overdose that will tip it over to killing the patient. You see the monitoring that has to be done day by day, sometimes hour by hour, titrating and figuring out how much morphine drip does this patient need at this time. Becomes delicate but real, but there's a way out, if you will. There's a whole scenario can be played out as long as we keep this vital distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs. See how it's applied? Yeah, okay. Questions, comments? All right. So in order to do that analysis, when we have to deal with this with family or friends who are on dialysis or so forth, we have to know first the basic biology, then some of the clinical setting, but ultimately the bioethical analysis to have the conscious at peace. And if they are unconscious, then whoever is proxy and so forth. Which, by the way, we'll get on into this course a little later on. One of the lectures is going to be on informed consent, proxy consent, durable power of attorney, living wills, and all those legal documents for if and when we become unconscious, that someone will make the decisions according to our wishes, which will be in line with the teachings of the Catholic Church. Okay, forward. So let us go into the unconscious state. Theoretically, not existentially. Okay. Okay, the little handout there. Yes.
Nice one.
Some lectures are always better than others. So the unconscious state, again, invariably what we're going to see here at the end of life, all right, the end of life issues, the end of life bioethical issues, is that there's going to be a range. So the standard is that there's a range. There's a range, if you will, from mild to severe and all the way in between. So the one peg that we can really, the one stake that we can peg on the floor, you know, on the ground and say that this is a crystal clear, let's say, principle, is that distinction between assisting or substituting. If you can walk away from this particular course with that very clear in your mind, is this procedure, this protocol, assisting or substituting a vital organ? That's the one thing that should be very clear in our minds and in our hearts, all right? Because everything else is going to be ranges. Ranges precisely based on the fact that we are now composed of trillions of cells and they don't all fail at the same time. So let's look at the unconscious state. This is both psychological and physiological, all right? But there's going to be a range there. And first, to consider the state of awareness. Awareness, again, is going to be a range. We are more or less aware of ourselves on a daily basis, on an ongoing basis, even on life. If you think about this for a moment, let's try to start at the very beginning here, how we become aware of self and the environment consciously, because we have conscious and we have subconsciously, right? Unconsciously would be in the subconscious realm generally. When you consider a baby, for example, a newborn, we can intuit, we really don't know, we cannot get inside a baby's brain literally to think, to see what she or he is thinking. Even we can do EEGs, electroencephalogram on babies and so forth, and newborns, but that's only going to give us wavelengths. What are they thinking, right? What are they knowing? What are they experiencing, especially of self and the environment? I think that it's a safe intuition to say not much, right? They're mostly just concerned with survival at that point. I'm talking about a newborn, normal newborn baby. And it takes actually years before we develop an awareness of self. I don't know if you've ever seen those little videos of a baby in front of a mirror. The baby in front of a mirror, they think there's another one in there. They want to go and play with that other baby over there. Okay, there's not much awareness of self yet, or at least that we can tell, that we can intuit from their behavior, just by observing their behavior. Then little by little, the baby starts becoming fascinated with things, and they'll grab something and they're kind of looking at it. And then invariably, it's like a two-step thing. They grab, and then whatever they grab, that object is going to go where? Into their mouth. Right? See if it's edible or not. Hopefully it is, but not poisonous or something like that. And that's a big problem for the toy industry, the baby toy industry. They're always concerned that the baby's going to eat the starfish or whatever it is that they're playing with. So it's that oral stage. Why? Because that oral stage, of course, is associated with suckling, which involves survival, feeding, right? So you can see that there's a lot of automatic behavior there, survival behavior, and not much aware of self, at least that we can tell externally from observing the behavior. Internally, we know that the brain is growing physiologically, and I think I mentioned this, right? It takes about, what, for the human brain to grow? About 24 years, between 20 to 25. And think of the insurance company. If you people have children, or remember when you got your own license, I got my license in Latin America, but the insurance, the car insurance rate changes at at 25, right? Okay, it drops at 25. Why? Why 25? Well, statistically, again, the industry also goes by evidence, right? Evidence-based. At this point, we have enough accidents to accumulate a huge data set and see that there's a drop in accidents in general at age 25. It starts dropping between 20 and 25, actually. Why? Because at that point, the human brain stops growing physically, physiologically. And so we have to assume that the mind, which happens on the brain, right? The mind, if we consider the mind being the psychological activity that occurs on the cerebral cortex of the brain, the higher functioning, the thinking, for example, there's a red light, I better stop, okay? Then it's fully developed. So the person on average at 25, in principle, has a full brain to think logically, reasonably, and so forth. Okay? At any rate, awareness of self, right, comes gradually and comes certainly years after we were born and even further after we were conceived, 9 months prior to the birth. So it's a gradual thing, this awareness of self and also the environment. It could even be, I don't know, but just thinking out loud and watching children grow from babies to toddlers and beginning to walk, let's say on average at 1 year of age, when they're grabbing onto things and holding on and letting go and taking a few steps, right? And falling flat and then getting up again. Thank God they're close to the ground, not much hurt. But they may actually be aware of the environment before we may be aware of the environment before we are aware of self in a deeper sense, because the environment is everything that we're holding on to and trying to put into our mouths. Mm-hmm. At any rate, there is an internal process and there's also an external process, and this brings difficulties to try to determine and assess exactly the state of awareness. And also by definition, the state of unconsciousness, which is lack of awareness. But there's a gradient there also. Clinically, one way of defining the unconscious state, all right, is a lack of response to painful stimulus. Again, looking at the norm and also just continuing to prep you for the statistics course that is coming up in the summer. The norm, a Gaussian distribution, a bell curve, right? What is normal, as we observe the majority of people, most of us respond to a painful stimulus. It's called a reflex act or a reflex reaction. We get pricked by a pin and we pull it back and we may say ouch or something else, okay? And so that is a response. It's called the reflex act. It goes to the brain and the brain shoots it back in less than a second to move that muscle, voluntary muscle, through the central nervous system. When there is the lack of that response, that's one clinical way of defining an unconscious state. Very far from saying this person is dead or dying. And that's why we have to consider this unconscious state and the different ways that it manifests. Because some of them actually look like death. Some of these unconscious states are so deep, profound, and that lack of response is so radical for a prolonged period of time that it seems like the person is dead. And in the past, they were actually buried. We'll get to that. All right, so some clinical definitions of different states of unconsciousness, right? Which come about through various stimulus. It could be injuries, it could be disease. So again, it could be something external or something internal. And invariably, it's going to involve the brain and or the brain stem. So the central nervous system. First, coma. Typically, the coma will be anywhere, a state of unconsciousness for more than about half an hour. Again, these boundaries or these numbers or limits are very subjective, but the basic standard in medicine is about half an hour. If a person is unconscious for about half an hour, could be declared in a state of coma after trying to revive that person for half an hour. Okay, let's think of an injury to the brain, a blow to the head, or something like that. Now, the medical practice has developed a scale that is called the Glasgow Coma Scale to try to quantify it. And they look at three main responses. All right, the eye, verbal response, speaking, and motor response, again, from the voluntary nerve, from the voluntary muscles, which are also known as skeletal muscles. They are the ones that connect bone to bone and allow us to move the skeleton voluntarily. Like, for instance, right now, I want to move my arm. I'm sending a message from my brain to the muscles in my arm, mostly the biceps, to move the arm, all right? On the eyes, is subdivided into 4 spontaneous movement, and there's a gradient here, you see, from 1 to 4, 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest score. And some have 4, some have 5, some have 6 on the gradient, because there's a larger range, right? So on the eye, spontaneous response to opening and closing the eyes, for example, is 4. That means that the person is really fully conscious. I voluntarily open and close the eyelids or move the eyes around and so forth. Also, reaction to light, all right? It's spontaneous. You know how the doctor comes, when hopefully you do a physical every year, and the doctor will come with a little light from the side and will go like this and back to the side. And that light, when the light is shining directly to the eye, is supposed to dilate or close the pupil, and that's a spontaneous response, right? Means that the eye is functioning well, normally. Whereas to speech, but not spontaneously, all right, then that's a 3. To pain, but not to speech or spontaneously, that's a 2, and no response is a 1. Now, to simplify that scale, you see how it works. Then looking at verbal response, again, the scale goes from 1 to 5, and you see the categories here, from being able to respond. What is the classical question? Who is the president today? Right? That's what they ask the people. So people may be fully conscious and not know who the president is, or not want to know who the president is, and it's a conscious decision. Okay?
I think with the publicity this president has gotten, he has not won America.
You gotta live under a rock not to know.
His name will be etched in history. So he's probably the first one to accomplish this.
Yes, that could be quite an accomplishment to be fully conscious and not know who the president's name is. To me, that has more value and merit than the opposite. But you see how the scale works, okay? It's a bigger range there, a little bigger range, all right? So that means it's just a little harder to determine from the speech response. And then finally, the motor response, see, and it could be any one of these. There could be no eye response. In other words, this could be at 1. There could be no speech response, again at 1, but there could be some motor response. And again, that scale goes from 1 to 6, okay? But you notice how the scale is worked out, because any combination of these numbers, of which the total is 15, right? 15. So half is a 50% thing. It's like a flip of a coin, really. The background to this is a 50-50 chance. 8 or less is considered comatose, right? So 7.5 is a 50%. See what I'm saying? Of 15, the half is 7.5. So they round it up to 8. But what I'm trying to say is that if a person, even if a person had full motor response, full motor response, but no verbal response and no eye response, that person would get 8. You see, which would be declared comatose. And so there's less value, if you will. It's kind of counterintuitive because there's a greater gradient on the motor response. It actually, each individual category has less value, all right? Because even with a full motor response, if the other two, if the eye and the speech are at no response, then the person will come to a maximum of 8 points and therefore declare comatose. See how it goes? Okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
One question, Father. Remember that famous case of Terry Shivo?
Yes.
Okay, and this was in I guess the benchmark of what's coma and what's not coma.
Exactly. Yeah.
So where did she fall in this?
Yes, exactly. That's a good question. I'm going to ask you to hold it because we're going to look at Terry's case in more detail when we get to PVS, persistent vegetative state, but within the lecture itself, okay? So we'll look at the case a little more closely and everything because that was extremely controversial. And I can tell you that that case was so controversial throughout the state that there was legal involvement from the governor, Governor Bush at that time, Jeb Bush, got some emergency law, executive order and so forth. It was extremely complicated. We had an intersection of medicine, law, ethics for sure. The church, the Catholic Church was very involved in it. And so we'll see it as a paradigm, if you will, to the point that it has set the stage. If there is a silver lining from that case, it has set the stage in our state in particular that there is kind of a negative predisposition from legislature, from the state legislature in Tallahassee to look at these end-of-life issues, okay? Which for now, it's in our favor because the group, the national group that is trying to push actively, very actively, with millions of dollars for physician-assisted suicide is called Compassion and Choices, right? Exactly. Talk about, you gotta laugh because if you don't laugh, you cry. I mean, it's so sick. Yeah, they used to be more honest. They used to be called the Hemlock Society. All right. Yeah. There used to be, that was more. Yeah. And of course, the hero is Dr. Kevorkian, whom we'll talk about also in another lecture and so forth. But that was the whole thing. Just, again, interpreting patient rights in an absolute way. That I have a right to determine, if I didn't have a right to determine when I was going to be born, then at least I'm going to have a right to determine when I'm going to die and how I'm going to die and so forth. So this movement is so strong that already 5 states of the nation have legalized physician-assisted suicide. Okay, and therefore, and that's 10% of the union already. That's 10% of the states in the union. All right, and they're in the legislation of about 24 states right now in the United States, including Florida. And the past ballot, thank God, it did not go all the way to the ballot, and the legislation did not go through legislation. It dies in committee, precisely because no legislature wants to get involved, no politician wants to get involved in this issue because they know the gut reaction of the people at large. And they get killed if they go in favor of physician-assisted suicide. Then they get, it's political suicide, ironically, because in town halls, when they're trying to get their votes, their constituency to vote, said, no, you voted for physician-assisted suicide. I don't want you representing me because you're going to put me to death, right? The state, it's the perception that the state is going to kill. So for now, that's a good perception for us because it's keeping physician-assisted suicide off, it's still illegal, bottom line. But the pressure is there, and the society has vowed to come back year after year to all the legislation of the, because in contrast to Roe versus Wade that passed at the national level, at the federal level, what this industry is doing, they're passing it at the state level, you see? Which is really, in a sense, it's a more solid law when it goes state by state, because they, well, you don't want to live here, you can move to another state. okay? Plus, it's not forced yet, all right? So it's voluntary, but the point is that this trend, as trends go typically, is not going to go in reverse. Predictably, the states that have become pro-suicide states, it's unlikely that they'll revert that anytime soon. Again, the typical pragmatic utilitarian mentality of interpreting patient rights as absolute rights. Okay, so the scale is there to help the doctors determine if the patient is in coma or not. And that coma state could go up to normally 6 months, but recently I had heard also that it could be as recent as 1 month, only 1 month. Jumping a little ahead of myself for PVS. But I wanted to talk a little bit about induced coma, because induced coma is a little different physiologically and therefore clinically also. So a normal, if you will, or regular coma is typically from some kind of insult to the brain, either a head injury or an illness. For example, it could be brain cancer or something like that. Different from an induced coma. An induced coma is when the brain is fine, but some other part of the body is not fine, is actually in crisis, and to help that person heal, the metabolism has to be lowered as much as possible. And essentially put the person, if you will, by analogy, into hibernation, like animals up north do naturally in the cold of winter, all right? So an induced coma is, just like the word says, is induced with medication. And they typically use a combination of 2 or 3 different types of medication. They're gonna use a somnifer, they're gonna use a sleeping, like an anesthesia type of medication, all right? A sleeping medication that lowers the brain activity. Not morphine necessarily, no, because morphine will do damage. They use other chemicals that induce like a sleep state, all right? So they put the person to sleep, really, not figuratively, not killing the person, as we say, put the animal to sleep. They actually, a somnifer is called, it puts the person to sleep, like a sleeping pill, if you will. But at the same time, sorry?
Activin?
Yeah, I was thinking too, Ativan.
It could be, I don't know the actual names of them, but that could be, right? It's some kind of a sleeping pill or a sleeping medication. That's one type of medication. But also they will give the person analgesics. Analgesics are pain control in case the person will feel pain from the procedure. For example, if a person is intubated on a vent, on a ventilator, all right? That person may feel pain from the tube going through their throat and so forth. And so they give the person analgesics, which are pain relief. And then the third type of medication, I think, are anamnesics. Anamnesics are that they don't remember. They're trying to erase the memory of the event itself, so they don't remember being in an induced coma, all right, because they may be there for days or weeks. And I know a particular case was a friend of mine who was intubated. She had a pneumonia and she was a transplant patient, so plus with a stroke. So she had a very complicated medical history. And on top of all this, transplant patients, they are on immunosuppressants. You should be familiar with these terms. Immunosuppressants means that they take medication to lower their immune system, to tone down the immune system. Again, we talk about a range here. It doesn't mean that the immune system is totally active or totally shut off. We could not have the immune system totally shut off and walk into the air that we breathe, because there's bacteria and fungi and viruses in the air that we breathe right now, all right? So we need some level of immune system. But the immune system can be toned down. It just means that these people have to be careful to infections and things like that. All right. So, for example, if they're in a room that is crowded with people, they need to wear a mask. And you see the transplant patients, they have to have care with their behavior. But she had a pneumonia, all right? And she was intubated and induced coma. And the immunosuppressants were also, she was taken off the immunosuppressants so that her immune system would build up. She also had to be on dialysis because she was on kidney failure, and it's a very, very complicated medical clinical scenario. But the bottom line is that she was in an induced coma for about 2 weeks to lower, and it looked like she was dead to the eye. If you didn't see the monitors with the electrocardiogram and the breathing pattern and so forth, right, which was very regular because she was like hibernating, right? And also she had a tube to her stomach, a NG tube, nasogastral tube, to put in food, pureed food directly to her stomach. Her digestive system was working fine, but she couldn't swallow. She has a tube in her throat for breathing into her lungs. And so, but that nutrition, which also supplies hydration, so simultaneously nutrition and hydration, is not going to be totally supplement, right? A total supplement. And so she was also going into self-consumption. In other words, the muscle tissue starts being digested by the body, by the enzymes. And so she was also losing weight. She went down to about 90 pounds, being from about 130 pounds, more or less. So she was going into self-consumption, which is okay for the time being. The muscles atrophy, right? They become very thin, but if the patient pulls out and goes back into therapy, then you got to ramp it up slowly with therapy, physical therapy, PT and OT, physical therapy from the hip down, and OT, occupational therapy, from the hip up. Those therapies are also named functionally, right? Physical therapy, meaning to try to get the patient to walk again, to be ambulatory. And OT, from the arm, to get the arms working and hands so that the patient can do some work. And that's what they call PT and OT, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Anyway, these patients that are going to they come out on a wheelchair to the rehab center, and they'll spend several weeks there, maybe months, recovering. But like I say, atrophied muscles, if they don't go beyond a certain point of no return, they can recover. We can recover muscle mass, all right? Mostly with exercise and a healthy diet and so forth, but the muscles do recover. They're some of the organs in the body that recover the best in general. So at any rate, all this to say that this is a patient that was in an induced coma, which medicine will do. The brain itself was okay, and that's the only thing that was okay. Basically, the rest of the body was had a lot of crisis. But to treat her and to treat the pneumonia, considering that she had been in immunosuppressants and kidney failure and all this, they tried to slow down her metabolism as much as possible. Thank God the patient pulled through, and she's alive and well today. She actually had a third transplant of a kidney transplant eventually. So induced coma, you see, is different. It's clinically induced and monitored on very delicate and complicated situations, but it can be done. And again, it is standard medical practice today, so typically with people who are intubated are on a ventilator. Okay, forward. No, that's backwards. Here's just a little image. These are MRIs of magnetic resonance of the brain. As you can see, the activity for a fully conscious person, there's a lot of activity going on, indicated by the range of colors, the spectrum here of colors. Whereas minimally conscious, you see little activity. Again, on the red scale is higher activity, typically measuring heat output, metabolism of the brain, high brain activity, okay? Whereas on the blue scale is low to almost no brain activity, that is vegetative state. But you notice what is being measured here is the actual brain, cerebrum, the two hemispheres of the brain. It doesn't say anything about the brain stem, which is down here at the base of the head, at the base of the skull, just above the neck. All right, this part of the head, that is the brain stem, also known as medulla oblongata. All right, and that controls the autonomic nervous system. So this person in vegetative state, when we look at the brain stem, what is your intuition? Is that also going to look dead like this? No activity, no function, no metabolism, or not?
I would say probably not.
Okay, just to give you a hint, the heart is beating, normal rate. The person is breathing, again, normal rate. And that's all controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which centers at the brain stem. Therefore, there's going to be activity there. Okay, and we would see possibly this kind of activity there at the brain stem. And that's why we have to make a difference. And when we talk about brain death, we're going to look at total brain death. In other words, not just partial brain death of the cerebrum, but total brain death, including the brain stem. And thank God that the clinical setting today, that's their definition of brain death also. It's total brain death. Okay, moving forward, we look at these, typically the coma will be not the induced coma, but a natural coma, if you will, would be from some kind of injury to the brain. So traumatic brain injury, TBI, is a clinical term, and it is a complex injury that will have physical effects, will have psychological effects, may have also social effects by way of relating, the patient relating to others and how others attempt to relate to that person, all right? So it has a complexity of effects at many different levels. Again, with a spectrum of symptoms from mild to severe, and may typically involve disabilities, right? Impairment, again, of movement or speech, of sight, and so forth. There is a site at Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic has a tremendous website of many, many different illnesses, disease, and accidents, and so forth. So typically you can punch in. I just punched in brain injury, and this site came up, traumatic brain injury, just one word.com, and it has a lot of material there. Again, these are resources if, God forbid, you have a family or a friend who has an injury to the head that is a traumatizing injury. In other words, they fall unconscious for some period of time, more than half an hour, and the doctors are trying to determine, and the family is trying to determine what's going on. This can give you some guidance, okay? Again, the range is from mild to severe, and the arbitrary bar is half an hour, simply because I don't want to wait a full hour before doing some other procedures, and maybe less than half an hour is a little too soon to declare the person comatose. Let's look at hypoxia. Hypoxia is low oxygen to the brain. And again, it could be from injuries, it could be from disease, trauma, accidents. A number of insults or offenses can cause this. But hypoxia is low oxygen to the brain, insufficient oxygen to the brain, whereas anoxia is no oxygen to the brain, okay? So when the baby or the child falls into the swimming pool, the very first seconds is hypoxia, and then within a minute or two, that baby is going to go into anoxia, right? Extremely dangerous. The brain happens to be the one organ that requires most oxygen in the brain. I think I read one time, maybe 60% or something like that of the oxygen consumption, or 60% of the circulation of the body, of the whole body, goes to the brain. It is, it requires a lot of oxygen, because the thinking activity right now, whether we realize it or not, the thinking activity that is going on now is a high metabolism, a very high metabolism.
Most of the food too.
Sorry?
Most of the food.
Yes, exactly. Precisely because of the nourishment, the glucose, and even the proteins, the amino acids and so forth that we needed, because at the physiological level, thinking is also a metabolic process, and particularly memory involves synthesizing proteins on the fly. As we're thinking and as we're memorizing things, proteins are being synthesized, and that's where the memory is actually stored in protein scaffolding in the brain. So it's a very high metabolic activity, which requires, of course, that the oxygen needed for the metabolism, cellular metabolism, okay? And also we give off a lot of heat through the head. That's why in the winter, the most important part of the body to cover is our heads. We lose a lot of heat through the head in the cold, all right? So maintaining head, and typically when you touch your head, it's kind of on the warm side because of the heat that is being diffused from the head by thinking, the thinking process. We're not exercising physically, all right? We're exercising mentally. And again, I read somewhere that we burn more ATPs, more calories by thinking than we do by physical exercise. About 2/3 more on average, okay? And that's why if we study for an hour, we feel more tired than if we run for an hour on average. And you know, when we're running, our eyes don't necessarily want to close, but if we study for an hour, certainly my eyes want to close. Yeah? If we're doing deep study. Let me finish the thought. And so what's going on? Why don't we lose weight? And some of the students say, well, why don't I lose weight when I study? Because it's consuming the glucose. It's consuming the active energy in the body, all right? It's not consuming the glycogen, which is the fat tissue. That one, for that one, you need the tennis shoes. You need the physical exercise. But thinking consumes a lot of energy, and therefore it requires a lot of oxygen, requires a lot of glucose and circulation and so forth. Okay, Deacon Lewis.
No, I'm just saying that that's the reverses of the true network. That's why my head is always cold.
Cold. You have a cool head is a non-thinking head. Well, a cool head actually tones it down, right? Yes, that's right. But a hot head is very active, right? And engaged. All right. Now, physiologically, what is supplying blood to the brain are the arteries coming up through the neck. And you have 2 pairs of arteries. Actually, this is 3 pairs. Sorry. This is a total of 3 pairs of arteries to the head. Again, keep in mind, arteries come out from the heart to the body, and they take nourishing blood. In other words, blood that has nutrients and blood that has oxygen. Veins come into the heart, all right? And veins are toxic blood, if you will. Veins have CO2, and veins have toxic waste from metabolism because they're coming from the body back to the heart to be repumped through the kidneys, through the liver, and to the lungs for expelling CO2 and all that. So the veins is the return circulation. But the outgoing circulation is the arteries, right? So the nourishing blood, if you will, we have like really, if you think about it, not only do we have closed circulation, meaning that is within vessels, all the way down to capillaries, but we also have 2 circulations going on. Is the circulation going out to the body and the circulation returning from the body. Okay? So to the head are the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. So and because we have a bilateral distribution, we have paired organs, right? Our bodies are kind of a mirror image on both sides. So that's called a bilateral distribution along the central axis. These are paired. So the vertebral arteries are further back on the neck, and they are back here. See, this is a vertebral artery here. This is another one here. They come in to the back, la nuca in Spanish, the back of the head into the brain region. The other ones are the famous carotid arteries, which we can feel a little better. That's what the doctor feels out here to check if there's a good flow, a good pulse, carotid pulse. And those are two pairs. They branch out. There's an internal carotid and an external carotid. All right, see? And I presume it's the external carotid that they're measuring. And they do this with a finger. And they also branch into the brain and distribute blood, good blood, nourishing blood, and oxygenated blood. So what can clog the carotids, and what can clog the vertebral arteries? Well, typically cholesterol, right? Cholesterol. And so one can look up plaque, actually residue, just like a pipe that accumulates residue inside. So now they can go in and clean out those arteries if they're very clogged. And then we go on a fat-free diet. Here's the aorta, this is the aortic arch. It's called the aortic arch, which is coming out of the heart. The heart would be here. And that's essentially the bulk of the arterial blood going to the body, not to the lungs, but to the body, is coming through the arterial arch. And that's why a rip there on the aorta can kill the person in or less than a minute, because they will lose a lot of blood, massive hemorrhage. The aorta is the largest artery in our body, right? It has a diameter of about a dime. That's pretty large, but it branches right away into the subclavial arteries, subclavial underneath the clavicle, right? Here's the clavicle, you can feel the clavicle bone, it's the one that sticks out here like a little fork like that. Underneath are the subclavian arteries. There's a little artery here that has no name, innominate, this little piece. But you see that the branching to the head is fairly fast, okay? In other words, the blood, arterial blood, branches to the head before it branches to the rest of the body. And so it's getting that high pressure head, and that's why high blood pressure can cause damage to circulation in the head, because it's fairly close to the heart on that initial pumping, the diastolic movement of the heart, okay? For example, with stroke victims, if some of this plaque gets this large and there's a clot and moves up into the capillary region, it can cause a stroke. Okay, so this is just a little background on the physiology of the circulation of the head, of blood, meaning oxygen and also the nourishment that is needed.
So Father,
Yep.
the capsule, Father, so the brain receives the blood
Mm-hmm.
through the two pairs of carotids and then one pair of the vertebra.
Yes,
That's the main source of say, energy. There.
of blood to the
flow.
brain. That's it, these three pairs. So if any one of these is cut or injured or severed, the brain is going to go into massive loss of blood, meaning massive loss of oxygen and massive loss of nutrition, but mostly it's the oxygen that is the most critical because of that high metabolism that we have, especially on the cerebral cortex, which is the thinking, is what's keeping us conscious, right? And the typical thing when we lose oxygen to the brain is we go unconscious, we faint. Which, by the way, speaking of that, you know that one cannot die by holding one's breath. Okay, I never suggest to do this ever, but when we were teenagers and we were living in Mexico at that time, Mexico City, had a group of friends, boys and girls, you know, the boys always trying to impress the girls, and we started this broma, this kidding of who couldn't resist holding their breath the longest. Okay, it's just Very stupid because we didn't have a full brain, right? We were teenagers. We didn't have a full brain, so we did stupid things. We would lie down, the guys would lie down on the floor like this and just hold their breath to impress the girls to see who could hold their breath longest. And since I've always done swimming and all that, I had pretty good range of holding my breath because I love snorkeling. You have to hold your breath when you go snorkeling down into the water and then come back up beyond a minute, close to 2 minutes. So we're doing that, and all of a sudden, one of the guys didn't wake up, in 1 minute and 2 minutes and 3 minutes. But thank God he's still breathing, all right, but he's unconscious. And so we try to slap him and get very scared, and we don't know what to do. The other teenagers in the area, finally he woke up, and what's going on? He fainted. Thank God, because what happens is when we hold our breath too long, okay, it's not so much the lack of oxygen, but the buildup of CO2. When we have too much CO2 in the body, then the brain gets a signal and it shuts down the voluntary nervous system, shuts down, okay, so that the individual starts breathing normally and no longer capable of holding one's breath. All right? Yeah?
She was the girl.
All the girls were very impressed by our stupidity.
Wow.
Never ever I'm going to date any of these guys. Okay, they really have very little brain, and now after they just when they sleep, they have less brain. So it was a very scary thing.
What is it when a diver stays too long on the suppression of the water on the outside, but they can't come up too fast?
Right.
And
Okay.
Otherwise, I have to put them in some kind of a chamber.
Right. A recompression chamber, a compression chamber, yes. I happen to also scuba dive, so I know about that. And there are several things going on. One is nitrogen narcosis, and the other one is that the bubbles expand. Let me get to that as soon as I finish this one, because it is relevant to the oxygen to the brain, basically. The idea is that when the brain receives insufficient oxygen and there is a higher amount of CO2, then the voluntary system shuts down, so we no longer have control over our breathing, and the autonomic nervous system takes over, thanks be to God. So it's going to move the rib cage, the diaphragm up and down on a rhythmic way, so to restore normal breathing, all right? Normal breathing, for instance, at night when we are, one state of unconsciousness is sleeping, right? Sleeping, which is natural and normal and restorative. And so the autonomic nervous system takes over fully. We don't have to be telling our hearts every few seconds, beat, 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 or we don't have to be telling our lungs, breathe, breathe, all right? Because the autonomic nervous system takes over the brain stem. But for that, it needs the proper amount of oxygen in the brain. Now, with drowning, which is very tragic, oxygen, not only the CO2, but actually the CO2 in a sense exacerbates it, because now the body wants to breathe normally, and what's it going to breathe? It's going to breathe water. It's going to inhale water into the lungs, which is not, our lungs are not gills. They're not designed to extract oxygen directly from water. There's insufficient oxygen there for the lungs, enough for gills, but it's a different design. And so the person asphyxiates, right? And there's insufficient oxygen to the brain. If the person is pulled out of the pool or the accident, within a few minutes, it depends on what kind of brain damage they have, But anywhere beyond typically between 3 to 7 to 10 minutes, there's going to be irreversible brain damage. They could fall into a vegetative state, not be dead, but may never recover full brain capacity because there was irreversible damage to the brain. So we can conclude then that the brain is one of the most vital organs, if you will, one of the organs that will die first, okay? Normally when there is a traumatic injury or insult that way. And since you brought up with diving, what happens there, okay. In contrast to liquid, and especially water, liquid water that doesn't compress, liquid water has so many properties that are interesting and unique. but liquid water is essentially incompressible. You can put a whole building on top of liquid water, and that liquid water maintains its volume. We'll talk more about that in next semester in the environmental course, and how some countries that are in seismic areas for earthquakes use water to float their buildings and absorb the shock. But there is oxygen and other gases that are mixed in the water. But when a diver is breathing, they're breathing with the aqualung, the tank, which, by the way, was invented by Jacques Cousteau. You know Jacques Cousteau, you ever heard that? When I started, it's one of my heroes, because when I came here when I was 17, I wanted to be a marine biologist. And I just wanted to go through the world, diving all the oceans of the world and sailing and all that stuff. And then the Lord had a different plan. But in the meantime, I learned about scuba diving. And it's very interesting because what he invented was a tank. Essentially, is air under compression. It's compressed air, right? So it's a gas tank. But instead of having natural gas or butane or propane or some toxic gas, right? It has just air, natural breathing air that is compressed under compression so that it can be taken down into the depth of the water. And what happens is then there is a regulator that goes to the mouth. And originally it was a single stage regulator. Now today there are two stage regulators, one at the base of where the tank connects to the hose, and the other one at the mouth, which brings it to ambient pressure. The one at the mouth is the critical one because that one brings it to the pressure of the depth of the water. So what happens with water? Water itself is incompressible, but water will compress anything that is in it, right? Because the pressure will essentially transmit down through the water column. And so at surface, at sea level, we have what is called STP, standard temperature and pressure, all right? But at sea level is 1 atmosphere of pressure, okay? Which is 1 atmosphere of pressure is the weight, the actual weight of the atmosphere upon that surface of the ocean. And just not right now, we are about the same. We're at STP here because the average height above sea level for South Florida is about 6 feet. So that doesn't make much of a difference on the pressure when you have several kilometers of air on top of us. So standard pressure, 1 atmosphere of pressure is at sea level, all right, at the surface of the sea, which is literally the weight of the molecules. That's why doesn't the atmosphere fly out? Well, because the gas molecules of nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2 and other molecules, gas molecules that make up the air that we're breathing, they have some mass. And because they have mass, they're subject to gravitational pull, which means that they also exert weight, okay? Anyway, there's 1 atmosphere of pressure at sea level. When you go down into the water, when we go into the water down, all right, that pressure is transmitted and amplified, multiplied by the actual weight of the water itself. Now, water is more dense than air. And so it takes less water, less column of water, less amount of water to exert the same amount of pressure. And it's been calculated already. The Navy did a lot of these studies way back in the 30s and the 40s, especially during the Second World War. So they already calculated that for every 10 meters of depth in the water, there is another atmosphere of pressure for every 10 meters. Now, what is a meter? Here is a meter. I happen to have one right here. All right, so this is a meter, which is how many feet? About 3 feet. 3 feet, 3 inches, and whatnot. Okay, so it's about 3 feet. So 1 meter is about 3 feet. It's also about 1 yard, right? Which is the length of one torso and one arm on average. It doesn't matter if it's the left or the right, it's about the same size. Okay, so that's for an individual. For an adult, more or less, that's the 1 meter, 3 feet. So 10 meters is how much in feet?
30 feet.
33 feet, right? Which may be the length of this room, more or less. I don't know, maybe there's 10 of these, more or less. So if you flip this room around vertically like this, that's about another atmospheric pressure. So if you go down 30 feet, on average 33, you're already at 2 atmospheres of pressure, okay? The one that's above the surface, at the surface, plus the other one of the water column itself, because the water column, why does the water stay inside the oceans and doesn't fly out? Again, water is subject to gravitational pull, to the core of the center, to the hot, quite hot metal iron ball that we have in the center of the earth. That's exerting the most gravity on the whole earth, all right? And we're all subject to it, otherwise we'd fly out into the sky, into the universe. All right, so at 30 feet, let's say we're down 30 feet, we're snorkeling down there, 30 feet of, now we got 2 atmospheres of pressure on top of us, okay? So we have been compressed. And let's translate that into something that we can actually see. Let's say a basketball. We take a basketball at standard pressure, at STP, the basketball is about this big more or less. Everybody's seen a basketball. That's at ambient temperature at 1 atmosphere of pressure. Let's say that we take this basketball with us down to 30 feet, all right? To 2 atmospheres of pressure. We double the pressure. What does that ball look like? Is it going to get bigger, smaller, or stay the same size? It's going to be compressed on all sides. On all sides, it's going to be compressed in and down, all right? To what size? To half the size. It's inversely proportional. It's the gas laws. You know, the more pressure, the smaller the gas, the more compressed the gas is. Okay, it's the same amount of air inside, the same number of molecules, but it's now they're closer together, the more compressed, they're under pressure. So that ball, that basketball, if we go down 10 meters or 30 feet, is going to go down to something like this, okay, half the size. Let's say we go down another atmosphere of pressure, another 10 meters, another 30 feet. Now we're at 60 feet, we're almost at 70 feet of water, right? The water column, we're at 3 atmospheres, that's going to compress again to another half. It's going to look like a tennis ball. The basketball is going to look like a tennis ball, but it's got the same amount of air inside. So it's under high pressure, high pressure. Okay, that's a basketball. How about the air inside, the oxygen, the gases that are inside our body, mostly in circulation, in the bloodstream? We've got oxygen for sure. We got a little bit of CO2, but the one that we have most of is actually nitrogen. The atmosphere that we're breathing right now is mostly nitrogen. It's 70 some percentage, about 75% nitrogen, 72, something like that. Nitrogen, gas nitrogen, okay? Not liquid nitrogen, but gas. And so, because at standard temperature, at room temperature, nitrogen is gas. That's why when nitrogen is compressed, it becomes so cold. Liquid nitrogen is at minus 170 degrees centigrade. But at natural temperature, if I have liquid nitrogen here, it's going to evaporate and it's going to become gas. So I'm trying to say is that we're breathing nitrogen all the time, nitrogen gas, N2, diatomic, all right? All the time. Does it do anything? No, it's what is called an inert gas, inert. It doesn't affect it. It goes in and out of our lungs, it goes in and out of our tissue, does nothing, or in circulation. But we have it inside at standard temperature. So the diver who goes down 30 feet or 10 meters, that nitrogen and the oxygen, but mostly the nitrogen, is compressed. So it's under pressure, but it's the same amount, all right, molecules, so it's compressed. If we go down further, it's further compressed. And the air, because the tanks, all right, the aqualung, the scuba tank, is just air. So it has the same percentage nitrogen in it. We're breathing that, but we're breathing it, remember the second stage on the mouthpiece of the regulator is at ambient temperature. In other words, is at ambient pressure. It's at the pressure of 2 atmospheres, 3 atmospheres, 4 atmospheres, down to 100 feet of, that's a technical dive, 100 feet of depth, all right? which means that that air that I'm breathing is super compressed because it's at the same pressure that the surrounding water column. So it's super compressed. And it's going in and out of my lungs. All right, it's going into my lungs, and then I exhale it through my nose. And you notice bubbles from a diver as they come up, those bubbles through the water column, and you see, you know, the diver. So you see the bubbles coming out, right, with her breathing or his breathing. As the bubbles go up, what have you noticed about the bubbles? They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they become huge bubbles. Okay, from little tiny compressed bubbles, they become huge. It's not that there's more air that is being pumped in. There is the same amount of air, but it's decompressing, all right? So it's expanding as it is meeting less resistance from less pressure until it hits the surface and breaks out into the, but by that time the bubbles could be this big, each individual bubble. The same happens with the body. And so the nitrogen that is dissolved, gas nitrogen and gas oxygen, gas air that is dissolved inside the bloodstream, if that diver comes up too fast, that air has not had a chance to diffuse out through the lungs, out through the nose, okay? And it's staying inside, and it's expanding inside, and it will cause typically what is known as embolisms. Embolisms are clots inside bubbles, all right? Which will clog the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries, and the person now is going to go unconscious. One thing you don't want to do when you're diving is go unconscious. You won't know which way is up and down. That's why you never dive alone. The first rule of diving, what's the first rule of diving? Well, the first rule of diving is plan your dive and dive your plan. The second rule of diving, never dive alone. Your body is like your other self. It's your life support, okay? And you have to learn how to body breathe and stuff like that, because you never dive alone, right? And your body can really save your life if something goes wrong. All right, so these air bubbles expand and start clogging up the system inside it. They clog the brain, it's bad news. And so typically they go into unconsciousness or shock, and the body pulls you out onto the boat, and the boat takes you to the helicopter, and the helicopter takes you back into a recompression chamber. And they put you back. That's why it's very important to have on your other devices what pressure and what depth you were. And that recompression chamber with air recompresses you back down into that pressure. And then over several days, several hours, it will decompress you slowly to allow for those bubbles which were reduced back to their size to be diffused out through the body slowly. All right, and hopefully there was no major damage. But that's the whole scenario of diving. It's a very serious sport. It's spectacular. To me, it's a little piece of heaven to be down into the coral and to see all the interaction that's going on. But it's delicate, it's technical. You get very level-headed when you're down there. Nitrogen narcosis is what can happen at great depths, where nitrogen starts diffusing into the brain and causes an effect similar to being drunk. All right, that's called nitrogen narcosis, and that's why you don't want to be drunk when you're diving down there, and therefore you have to. Then there are the tables. The diving tables tell you how long you can stay at what depth before you start getting nitrogen narcosis or before you start running into problem. And then if you go beyond that time, when you come up, then you have to stop at certain depths to decompress, right? And for several minutes, or sometimes it could be half an hour, depending on how deep you went. And the typical first stage will be at 10 meters. But if you did a very technical dive for over 10 or 15 minutes, you probably have to stop at 20 meters first for a few minutes to half an hour, and then 10 meters again, and so forth. And they'll lower you, because at that point you've run out of air, so you'll set up tanks actually down there with a rope. Tanks are set up and everything else. It's technical. That's why you plan your dive, and then you dive your plan. And that's, if you stay, the other silver lining, if you will, or the moral of this story, if you stay less than 30 feet, right? If you stay within the upper 10 meters of the water column, you don't have to decompress. You can stay as long as your tank lasts, which could be maybe an hour. If you take a single tank, 2 hours if you take 2 tanks, and so forth. So you can stay, in principle, indefinitely, as long as you have enough air supply within one atmosphere pressure. Okay, the body can handle that okay. And the other thing is that most of life that you want to see if you're just doing recreational dive is within the first 30 feet, because then the light is filtered out, and in the lower depth you don't get the coral formation, and you don't get the variety, plus you can't see, the light is filtered out and you don't really see much colors anyway. So to get full light within the upper 10 meters, the first 30 feet, is the best all the way around. All right. So brain hypoxia is serious. It can go into unconsciousness. Anoxia is total lack of oxygen to the brain. Within a few minutes, that brain is going to die. Another state of unconsciousness is epileptic seizure. Now, let's see. I see it's 11 o'clock already. You want to take a little break here and come back? It's been going on for a couple hours already. And this might be a good time to break for a few minutes. All right, so that for about 10 minutes, if you don't mind. And then we'll come back. We'll probably only go until about noontime. Okay, so I'm gonna pause for a moment, take a little break, and we'll come back. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. Let's see where we're at. Oh, yes. Any questions or comments from anyone? No? We're good. Let's continue now. Another state of unconsciousness is epileptic seizures, also known as epileptic fits, all right? And again, there's a range here, but typically there is an overactivity of the brain. So this is on the opposite end. It's an abnormal, excessive, generalized, and synchronous activity of the brain. So if you think of each one of these, you can see here an EEG of different parts of the brain. Everything is all firing up at the same time. So this is kind of the opposite end. Instead of toning down, it's actually an overreaction of the brain for whatever stimulus or injury. Typically it's a biochemical stimulus, but it's a huge amount of electrical activity, which can send the person also into a coma, into an unconscious state. Right? Now, today, this is all studied, and with the EEG particular, it can be determined. But in the past, these epileptic seizures sometimes put the person as if they were dead. And there was no detectable pulse or breathing. And sometimes people were buried in older times. And there even, I found on the internet, some interesting designs of caskets and graves in case people would wake up inside the grave. This one, for example, has a bell, little bell here, all right? And this one has a breathing tube with some kind of a whistle, I think, as the air goes through here, the person breathing, it will ring a whistle and maybe make some pulley move. But these are elaborate designs of caskets in case people will wake up. This one, for example, you can actually see the hand of the person here would move this contraption up and down, and the flag would wave up and down, which would be an abnormal movement. The air would move it horizontally, but when this flag is moving up and down, it was a call for help. This is an actual photograph of one of these old graves, and you can see here the bell and the little cord going into this tube, and the tube going down into the ground that is secured by this tower, all right? And so this was real back in olden times. And I also found online some coffins that were scratched on the inside. I didn't want to show those, but that's the evidence that they had, that sometimes people had woken up inside, okay? And so this issue of epilepsy and other comatose stages and could be very significant and traumatizing. Thanks be to God, today we don't have to worry about any of this. Why? Because one of the first things that I hear the morgue does when we die, or not the morgue, but actually the funeral parlor, is they drain the blood from the body. It's part of the embalming process. Okay, so if there's no blood, then there's no life. Okay, there's no longer any way to sustain the tissue or to sustain the brain. And therefore, one of the first things that the funeral director does in the funeral home is that they drain the blood of the cadaver. But the cadaver has to be declared clinically dead by the doctor. So again, it falls on the doctor, on the competent professional, to declare a person dead by the clinical evidence, and there's a protocol that they follow to do that.
Father, do you hear me?
Yes, Father Dayan, hello.
Good morning. Just referring to the example that you just presented of the bell connected to the deceased's hands in the casket.
Yes.
Does the saying "saved by the bell"?
Yes. Very interesting.
It comes from that. It comes from that era. Yes.
It actually comes from there, huh? Saved by the bell. Look at that. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you. There you go. New insight.
One of our greatest spiritual writers is Thomas A. Kempis.
Yes.
Who wrote a famous spiritual book on the imitation of Christ.
Yes.
Some of the hypotheses, and this is what we have read and we have studied, that he is not a saint, is that he died, and many years later, when they pulled him out, exhumed him, exhumar,
yes.
They found the same marks on the casket, in the casket.
Yes.
And they said that he was buried alive.
Wow.
And the reason why he hasn't been made a saint or canonized is that perhaps in that moment of desperation, he blasphemed.
Right.
And that's why he cannot be made a saint, because of the doubts that they have.
Wow.
That's one hypothesis, right? One hypothesis. But saved by the bell.
Wow. So from Tomás A. Kempis, right? And yes, exhumation of the body of the cadaver is a procedure, is one of the procedures in the process of being declared a saint, of beatification. Actually, the first stage is that, and they have to look for that kind of evidence, to make sure that the person was not really buried alive, and then possibly despaired in that anguish, right, realizing where he or she was. And one thing that they do look for is scratch marks on the inside of the coffin, which were not there when the coffin was built. So saved by the bell, look at that. I always associated it to school, the student, right, that was supposed to give the report or give the answer and so forth, and all of a sudden the period ended and the bell rang for going on to the next class. But this gives it a different meaning, much more bright. Thank you. You're
welcome.
Amazing. Okay. All right. A few other stages. Now, syncope or fainting, right? It's a temporary loss of consciousness, and typically it's associated with a drop of blood pressure. So low blood pressure as a whole going to the brain, and the brain again shuts down automatically, all right? And sometimes it's called syncope or fainting spell. Some people who typically have low blood pressure, all right, they're prone to these fainting spells. I'm realizing that I didn't have a slide. Oh, this is a slide. Let me talk a little bit about PVS, because this is really one of the main ones for bioethical issues. Persistent vegetative state, or sometimes also you see it in the literature, permanent vegetative state. the acronym PVS, and even now summarize into just vegetative state, VS. So you run across this acronym in the literature, end of life issues, VS, the vegetative state, is beyond coma, all right? And the standard more or less is 6 months, which again is very arbitrary, just like declaring a person terminal so that they qualify legally for hospice, right? And medically, the person has to be declared with a terminal illness. And the standard is, well, you have 6 months to live. I'm sure we all know people who died a month or a few weeks afterward. They were told that they had 6 months to live, and others who are still alive 3 or 4 years later after they were told that they had 6 months to live. Okay, so that's kind of the standard, but it's a very arbitrary thing. Who knows, really? Who knows? But typically, a vegetative state is after 6 months of coma, for example, all right? Without much change to the person, but just the duration. That person may be declared in a vegetative state, but again, it's very arbitrary because I've seen sometimes even after a month of being in a deep coma, the patient has been declared vegetative state. What happens here is that the central nervous system, in other words, the brain, the active cortex, is basically shut down, but the autonomic nervous system, in other words, the brain stem, is still functional, maintaining basic metabolism, in other words, maintaining circulation because the heart is still pumping normally, and the lungs are still breathing. And if the patient is put on either a peg, a tube to the stomach, or if it's temporary, a gastric tube, a tube from the mouth to the stomach again, the person can be fed, nourished, and they are in a vegetative state, which is the consensus of Terry Schiavo's state, all right? Now, again, we're going to visit this in more detail when we look at her case, but the vegetative state is beyond coma by the duration. And once a person is hooked up to a ventilator, and let's say a peg, which would be the two instruments keeping that person alive, maybe an IV also for hydration, but the peg, the tube to the stomach, can also hydrate the patient because of the shake that is pumped into their stomach. The person could be maintained indefinitely, more or less indefinitely, sometimes for years. And so we have to ask at that point, is the life being prolonged or is the death being prolonged? Okay, and it will go down to the vital organs. Well, the vital organs failing irreversibly, it could be time to disconnect this relative or this friend, because what we're doing is actually prolonging the death and not prolonging the life. So it's a patient by patient decision, and it's delicate and it's complicated, it's complex. We have to look at the whole scenario of factors, beginning with the physiological condition of the patient, but also the psychological and the social, meaning the relationship with other people in this patient's life. Okay. All right, let me move down to other unconscious states. Sometimes there are seizures that are non-epileptic. They don't have to do with the hyperactivity of the brain, this generalized hyperactivity, but other seizures that can happen sometimes from chemical poisoning or something like that, or it could be certain traumatic injuries, gas intoxication, who knows. One that is very dangerous, by the way, is smoke inhalation from a fire. Way before a person is burned to death, all right, or even suffers significant burn to the skin or to the body, smoke inhalation will kill the person, all right? So what we have to be careful with the fire is not so much the fire, the active heat of the fire itself, but the smoke. Smoke inhalation is very traumatizing to the brain precisely because of hypoxia or anoxia. And so in a fire situation, the first thing when you see fire is drop to the ground and crawl close to the ground, all right, because that's where you're going to find the most oxygen. One silver lining about smoke in general, depending on the type of smoke, but general, let's say the common burning smoke rises to the top of the container of the building or the floor, whatever, okay? And definitely if you have a cell phone, 911 right away and walk out to the, or crawl out to the first exit you find. Locked-in syndrome. Let's look at locked-in syndrome for a moment because locked-in syndrome is different from PVS. It could look like PVS, but in PVS you saw the MRI here. The brain itself has no activity, different from the stem. The stem is alive, but the brain itself, there's no significant brain activity. So this would give a flat EEG, electroencephalogram. With locked-in syndrome, the brain is very much alive, but what you have is that the person cannot communicate verbally, so it's more of a motor issue. Cannot really get the vocal cords to say anything. The person is kind of trapped inside their own body, cannot move a muscle, except for blinking, all right? And maybe vertical eye movement. So for some reason, vertical eye movement can still remain voluntary and some blinking. But the person, the brain itself is alert and aware as long as the brain is receiving sufficient blood, arterial blood, meaning nourished blood with oxygen and nutrients, okay? But the person, that brain is kind of a prisoner to its own body. And that's locked-in syndrome. And unless one focuses on the eyes of the person, the blinking, all right, it cannot be diagnosed. And different, for example, what occurs with PVS, where a person's eyes can track. And I'm saying a person's eye, I'm not saying that the person itself, him or herself, is actually aware. But in PVS, in vegetative state, it is known that the eyes can track movement. Typically, a person who comes into the room of a person who is in vegetative state, all right? And that happened with Terry Shavo. She could track someone sometimes who came into the room. Could be a relative, her parents typically who came to see her, or the nurse would walk in and walk across from the door to the window, and she would track them with her eyes, but that's typically horizontal movement, all right? But it was the eyes that were following that motion. We really don't know that there was anything happening in the brain beyond the eye, that information was not being processed. Very different from locked-in, where the mind is aware, okay? But there's no actual tracking. Actually, they're trying to communicate with their eyes, either by moving their eyes up and down or blinking. And so there is the development of kind of a rudimentary alphabet, all right, with blinking to try to communicate something. The simplest one is open eye yes, close eye no, all right? But then several blink is almost like a Morse code, if you will, so that this person can communicate what they're thinking, because they're definitely not dead. None of these cases are dead, by the way. Unconscious is not dead. So I'm giving you examples, the people that may look like dead, but not dead at all. Okay, so to round it up a little bit, the instruments that are used here, either the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, just like the word says, it is a wave, magnetic wave that is sent through the brain that can detect the activity of soft tissue, the electrical activity, because so the thinking process, at the detail level on the cortex, on the cerebral cortex, right on the surface of the brain, with its convolutions, its in and out, is an electrochemical activity. And therefore, it can be detected, that activity in the different centers of the brain can be detected by an electromagnetic wave going through the brain that seemingly doesn't do any damage to the brain. All right, so these are considered non-invasive diagnostics. But of course, depending on the sounds or depending on the setting. If you set up the setting strongly enough, of course, it could damage the brain. Right? That's also why when you go into these tubes, you're not supposed to have metal or cell phones or anything like that, because that could react with the machine and throw off the settings. All right, so MRI is one. Another one is positron emission tomography. So this is a PET scan. They try to measure different types of activity or different types of wavelengths of the brain activity. Okay, and the other one, the CT, is a computed tomography. Tomography is like the topography, like the shape of the cortex, of the cerebral cortex, again with its folding in and out, the convolutions. And these are the different diagrams that are obtained there. So these are like analogous to photographs, all right? In other words, they are portraying, revealing, quantifying the actual activity of the brain that is going on in the different states. As you can see here, this is the locked-in syndrome. And again, a syndrome is also that has a variety or a range of symptoms or manifestations. It can be a range, like for example, Down syndrome. You know, there's a range, typically from mild to severe, either mentally and or physically, right? So whenever you see the word syndrome, it's talking about a range of symptoms or manifestations of that illness, of that event. Minimally conscious state we saw earlier also, PVS, coma. You see, they all give different imaging on the diagnostics. And so there are different types of activities that are occurring, but to the observer, they look as if they were dead, all right? And here is brain death, total brain death, which would include, the brain stem is actually here, this little triangle here at the base of the brain, sorry, this one here, the brain stem. This is the brain stem here. And then the spinal cord continues down below the brain stem. Okay, so that's what I have today for this unconscious state in general. Different types, okay? But they all have a different clinical definition, if you will. And the patient may look like they're dead, but they're not dead. All these unconscious state means, by definition, that they're still living. And therefore, they require at least minimally care from the bioethical perspective. Even if there's no cure, care is obligates. And the typical care is going to be three things, which will be nutrition, hydration, and then shelter. Actually, four things, which is the human contact, human interaction somehow, so they're not totally isolated like a robot or a machine from human interaction. But we can say that organically, they need nutrition, hydration, and shelter. In other words, not exposed to the elements, right? Precisely because they are in a state of dependence, analogous to the unborn in her mother's womb that is in a state of dependence, a radical state of dependence. Then whether the patient has a cure or not really depends on which type of unconsciousness the patient is experimenting. Okay, that's all I have. So if there's nothing else, then we finish here. I'll send you the link as we're done. and then we continue. Next week we have the lecture again. And I send you the syllabus, right, for this course. So again, check your email, please. You should have the syllabus that you can download, and you can see the modules that we'll cover. We'll have, I think, about 5 or 6 other modules to go forward. All right. Okay, you're welcome. Questions, comments? No?
Joey,
Some people owe still summaries from previous lectures, even from the other course. So please catch up on that so that I can finish and close the other course, all right? All right, thanks again.
Thank you, Father.
Here.
Bye.
Okay, thank you, and all the best. Holiday and God bless. Stop.